our lives, our human lives, most essentially are the expression of both the complete uniqueness which we are. Life has never expressed quite like this, right? Quite like that, quite like that, quite like that, ever before, and never will do so again. Our life is essentially an expression of something completely unique, and simultaneously is most essentially an expression of, we could say, the totality of life. So this uniqueness we might point to, and yet at the same time we can't separate this life, which we feel to be here, and have this psychology and this history and these stories, etc. We can't separate that out from all the conditions that give rise to it, and all the ways in which we kind of commingle and participate with all of the rest of life. And there's a certain kind of tension, an essential tension, I would say. An essential dynamic between these two, what initially seem like polar opposites, right? Individualness, uniqueness, and some sense of vastness and totality. So I'd like to explore a little bit. I'd like to look through a kind of lens of Dharma understanding, or let's say look through a lens of Dharma exploration at this tension and the ways it actually plays out in our lives, which we might discover as we go on, that there are many ways, many facets, many scales on which this tension plays out in our lives. I mean, just the journey of, if we take the whole of a human life, we might have a particular kind of cosmological or theological lens we look through to describe that. But that the kind of what's basically a mysterious emergence into life of a human being, and then a kind of equally mysterious disappearance out of life at the other end. And there are various stories, mythologies, cosmologies, theologies that try to understand or describe what that is, or try to describe where we're coming from and where we go to. So we kind of all grew up, whether in a particularly kind of believing family or not, we've nonetheless grown up against a cultural background of a Judeo-Christian kind of cosmology, theology, which we may have grown up with, or we may have grown up around a rejection of. We may ourselves have adopted or rejected. But nevertheless, we've got that sense, that's kind of our worldview has grown up in that there's some sort of, as far as I get the sense, Christianity, for example, doesn't have too much to say about where we come from. It's sort of one-way traffic. It's like they have a lot to say about where we're going to, right? Heaven or hell. But I don't know. If maybe you do, maybe somebody who's more steeped in Christian theology. It wouldn't be hard to be more steeped in Christian theology than me. But is there any sense of where we come from, where the origin, any theology around that? I don't know. No, we just somehow arrive, another soul, and then going to heaven or hell, which presumably just must be getting fuller and fuller and fuller as time goes by. So there's the theology, and there's some flaws in it, I would say. Not least of which is it only addresses one end of the spectrum, and there's no story for the other end. We might look to the kind of Eastern traditions, which would speak in terms of the language of the kind of the unmanifest becoming manifest, and then at the end of life, the manifest becoming unmanifest again. Emptiness into form, form into emptiness. And the kind of Buddhist cosmology around that also is flawed to a certain extent. There's a lot of talk about not self, and which then people rightly say, well, all this talk about not self, what is it that gets reborn then? It's very difficult. It's a good question. It's kind of a little uncomfortable marriage of a teaching of rebirth with a teaching of not self. So that also, it's, there's a theology, and there might be great value in exploring and contemplating the theology of that, but it also has at least a potential flaw in there. A kind of more atheist, or let's say nihilist view might say there's nothing. Just nothing, and then suddenly there's something, and then at the end of that something, there's nothing again. Which is a little bit flawed as well, I would say, just because you need to explain how nothing can become something. How something can become nothing. So we could look through all kinds of theological lenses at that journey of life, but if we put aside any theology we may have personally, or any of these particular lenses that we could tell a story about what happens, what we're confronted with is the mystery that life appears, right? It's undeniable. If you're a parent, or you've been at a birth, or you just contemplate, how did I get here? We've got a story about how we got here, but actually it's beginningless. Our memory is beginningless. There's some mysterious emergence into life. And we may contemplate, or may try to ignore, push away the reality that this emergence will at some point in the distant or not too distant future de-emerge, disappear. And in between, all the vibrancy of our life, all the intensity of our life, all the passion of our life. And yet, it's rather reductionist maybe to say, well, just something that comes in and goes out. One of my teachers, I remember saying how he walked in a graveyard and saw all these gravestones, 18 something or other to 19 something or other. And then he realized, wow, the whole of human life can be summed up by that little line in between. Right? There's a date, and then another date. And that was it. While that person was alive, all that intensity, all that emotion, all those desires and defenses and distractions, and all the attempts to deal with that, all the networks of relationship. And we may sense the loss of that when someone close to us disappears. And yet, quite quickly, within a generation or two, which in the scale of cosmological time is not even a blink in the eye, within a short time, 50 years, 100 years maximum, people will walk past our gravestone, and really there's nothing more left than that little line between the dates. And I think that kind of, sometimes when we're kind of obsessively caught up in my dramas and my stories and my needs and my wants and my relationships and my plans and etc., etc., that kind of expansion of perspective that recognizes both the fragility and the fleetingness of my life can be very kind of sobering, very perspectivizing, if that's a word. Giving some perspective to the amplitude that my stuff has taken on. So we see this movement throughout life, as from some kind of ground of being, I could say, something that's at least so dissolved into the wholeness of life that it can't be found as an individual. Right? We can't find any individual prior to our birth, or at least prior to conception. And yet then there's something emerges which becomes very, very individual, and then there's death at the other end, beyond which we can't find anything individual. So there's some kind of movement from what we might call, to see the words that might fit for you, wholeness to individuality, back to wholeness. Or some playing out of this tension, this